How's it going, everyone? Thank you for joining me on a new episode of the Music Viewer Podcast. My name is Josh, and welcome to a new album review. This is going to be the first one since about early October, and this is going to be episode number 70, so thanks for tuning in. If you're returning, awesome to see you again. If not, thanks for tuning in today. All this podcast is a discussion sort of thing where I talk about music. This is typically done with album reviews, and today the album review that we're going to do is over the latest Mild High Club album, Going, Going, Gone. This was released on September 17th, so just about within the 1 month window I get myself to release a review. But nonetheless, I was kind of surprised by this project or album when I listened to it the first time. I was aware of the band for a while, but now I'm kind of, more intrigued, and I'm glad I listened to it. So, stick around for some of my thoughts on this album from the American psychedelic / funk experimental project, Mild High Club. But anyways, just some updates, though, on the podcast. Last album review, like I was saying, was early October. It was over the latest Lil Nas X album, Montero. I thought that was a really nice album. Had a few thoughts on there overall, and I thought it was a pretty solid effort for a debut album as well. Nice, change of things in the pop / hip hop scene. Tune into that review if you're interested. Listen to the album as well. Not much else. There is a episode of Talking Tracks, episode number 5, that will be releasing right after this episode, or around the same time, because it's pretty much ready to go. It just needs to be edited. But nonetheless, let's go ahead and talk about this record. All right, so like I was saying earlier, this is the latest, I believe, third album by the project, Mild High Club, titled Going, Going, Gone. They're an American psychedelic, quote-unquote pop group, indie pop group led by Alexander Breton, who formed the project pretty much on his own accord sometime in the early 2010s. Some background on them: they played flute in high school somewhere in the Midwest and attended Columbia College to study jazz studies. And in 2013 founded Mild High Club. Legend has it that it took about 3 years to write the first Mild High Club album. And following that, while the sophomore album was released in 2016, there was about a 5-year gap between this current album here, Going, Going, Gone, and the sophomore album, Skip Tracing. But it's also worth noting that there was a collab project with the band King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard, a band we covered earlier this year with their latest album, and Mild High Club in 2017. It's quite, in my opinion, it is a little bit notable because I cannot think of any other artist that King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard has collaborated with to such an extent to this day to put out like a full-length project. So I thought that was an interesting note. And I guess I'll take that a little bit further and state that had I not ever listened to that project between King Gizzard, the Lizard Wizard, and Mild High Club a few years ago, I probably would have never really have been introduced to this band, or it would have happened another way. But over the years, I have listened to a few of their songs, but I will say I'm not like a regular listener of the artist or anything. But honestly, with all that being said, going into this, I was quite interested in getting familiar with this current project here. But as I always do on pretty much all the reviews, if there is a prior album, I go back and listen to that just to get a little bit of a, familiarity and a sense of what the previous project was like and where they could possibly have been headed. So I listened to the project Skip Tracing from 2016. Not too much to say on that, but I do dig the jingly auxiliary percussion textures at points in like the track. With the opening track, Skip Tracing, the track overall is a bit sleepy and bare, though, I will say. Homage is a familiar sounding track that throws on some psych flavor to the overall sound with playful synths and a mobile bass line. Tessellation opens up with a fun R&B funk-inspired groove that structures the track. It's pretty good. And Cocopelli was probably one of the better tracks with another psychedelic and hazy cut that I thought was one of the better tracks on the album. And just with that alone, with the limited listening I did with Skip Tracing, I kind of got the sense that I was digging the band overall when they were more pressed on their psychedelic sort of sound that kind of comes out a bit naturally, and they kind of do it in a sense that, like, That's sort of their bread and butter, although the band obviously does things that are different and they do other things well. For instance, they kind of have a sort of hazy, dreamy nature overall, and then also some slight jazz and funk influence thrown in that can sort of give the music at times some momentum or energy as well. So they're not the typical dreamy ambient act like you can maybe categorize, a lot of bands that fall into dream pop as sounding like that, or maybe even some shoegaze bands, even though they're not, I don't consider Mile High Club a rock band. They certainly do have that sort of touch that comes from a band playing together as an ensemble, which I guess kind of makes sense with the jazz studies background that the frontman Alexander Breton has. But anyways, going into this latest project, I will say I think this is an improvement from Skip Tracing, mainly because of the songwriting. I think is a bit more concise. I think ideas are presented quite clearly and executed quite well from track to track. And overall, it's just a more captivating experience. And I'll say that it left me wanting to hear more from this project, or from Mild High Club in general. And maybe I'll admit that I was, pretty naive or just lazy for not getting more into the discography at an earlier point. Overall, starting with the first track on the album, Cludges 1. It's kind of like an introductory track, but it kind of sets the tone for what would come, or what's about to come on this album in general. Some jazzy melodies and harmonies that are found sprinkled throughout most tracks. A fat, thumpy, and buzzy bass. There's a lot of great bass performances on this album. Some vibrant, sparkly, and bright synths and piano melodies, colorful brass usage that, kind of fall into more of like the jazz implementation. And there's just a nice warm color on this track. I do dig it a bit. But I will say not until the second track, Dionysian State. I don't think I said that right. We get the first highlight here. Here there's a bit more of an upbeat nature on the track compared to the opening one. Some nice rich vocal harmonizations, a lovely funkiness driven by the low end, and some nice syncopated rhythmic patterns in the drum track. I also don't mind some added hand claps substituted in for snare at times, or just to, texture the track a bit more. It's not as annoying as other tracks, especially when it's found in mainstream pop. I think it's tastefully done here. And I'm really digging the psychiness that's brought out by the synths here. They're kind of playing to their strengths on this track, and I'm liking it. And the track kind of gets a bit trippier as it progresses. The track does kind of reiterate the main groove a bit, but overall it's a nice, interesting track. After that, Trash Heap, I thought this was a pretty good song. I will say it does get interesting as it transitions to the next track, Taste Tomorrow. But overall, Trash Heap, it's laid back. There's a lounginess to it, kind of similar to the vibe you get from the last Arctic Monkeys album. Some auxiliary percussion, that's a nice touch. The softness of the piano track I'm really liking as well. But I will say, you almost don't notice this track end unless you're actively looking at the track listing, literally on whatever platform you're listening to this on. And it just seamlessly goes in an interesting way to the next track, Taste Tomorrow, which I think is a highlight. There's a light, sinister, and demonic texture on the vocals on here. I will say there's not vocals implemented on a lot of tracks that consistently, but when they're done, I think they're done, in a way that makes the track better, or it helps the track become more interesting. Love the clunkiness or the slow down nature. It's slowed down and clunky in a good way. Very spacey. It's almost too much though. Almost like everything is so spaced out in the track that it might not obviously relate, altogether to the listener. It's not bad. It's just interesting. But there's a nice decay on the ending, and overall, I think it's a nice track. And after that, we get an interesting cut with a new high. I will say this is a unique track, especially with the breathy and soft female vocal textures that just only show up once on this album. Some messy and busy jazz melodies that I really like. There's just overall a lovely groove on here. It's almost Latin-like. Tango, maybe. I don't know the exact genre or subgenre of like Latin music this is from. But it's implemented quite nicely. And I like the dry percussive textures on here as well. Also accompanied by like some mobile and melodic bass lines. It's a nice track. The next track is definitely a highlight with It's Over Again. The track is mainly comprised of this steady R&B groove. But it definitely becomes like this trancey and dancey sort of track naturally. Definitely captivating. Overall, it's a bit of a jam kind of track. Although it is probably one of the more poppy and accessible tracks, mainly with the vocals that are provided here. It's a bit hooky, but it does end up evolving to like this busy and driving outro that becomes mainly a jam. It's not a bad cut. Also, I love the accented and slappy snare hits that kind of throw on a lot of flavor onto this track. After that, we got Cludges 2. There's a bit of like a more upbeat hip hop nature on here. Some fuzzy and trippy synths that come in and out. And also some thumpy and big staccato bass hits that I dig as well. The track can become a little unorganized towards the end. And it loses a bit of its charm, but it's also not a bad cut. After that, we get another highlight with I Don't Mind the Wait. I'm digging here the ominous beginning with the glitchiness of it all. There's a lot of soulful flavor to this with some also quirky synth embellishments that I dig. Also light and fluffy percussive elements on this track that I think are quite nice. Not sure if I like the sort of ambient interlude section that kind of feels a bit thrown on and a bit uncomfortable when it transitions to there. But, the track is a bit more interesting the more it goes on. And overall, I thought it was a nice listen. After that, Dawn Patrol. I thought this had a lot of potential, but the track ends up finishing faster than it begins. And it's more like an interlude track, but I do dig the way it's open, the way the track opens up. Just not really what the end result becomes of it. And after that, the track Waving is a nice highlight. Nice production on the drums here. They're clear, prominent, and dynamic. Love the R&B qualities thrown on here with some really dense low ends that give the track a bit of weight. Wish there was maybe just a little bit more added on to this track. Maybe it could have just been developed to sound a bit more grandiose or just more textured. But I do dig the trippy and psych nature on this track. I think their Mile High Club is really strong when they stick to that. The next track has a really interesting title, Me, Myself, and Dollar Hell. I thought this was, I know I said earlier another track was maybe the most accessible and poppy, but I think this actually takes the cake. Mainly because of how similar it sounds to like what you'd expect from an artist like Rex Orange County. Maybe this is just a bit jazzier, but I do dig the nice mini guitar solo interlude section that's on here. Some very low, deep vocals that are thrown on that I think are nice. And it's just a more straightforward and hooky cut than like the rest of the album. But it's quite nice. I wouldn't be mad if I heard a whole entire Mild High Club album sound somewhat like this. There's, I think, an accordion outro. It becomes a bit eerie. So, yeah, it's an interesting way to this is kind of towards the end of the album. I will say this is probably like the last track officially or unofficially, because after that we get Holding On to Me, which, it's a very short, weird way to end the album. It's definitely mysterious and ominous and very synth driven, with some interesting textured percussive qualities and a smooth main theme sung in the vocals, but it's not really a whole entire song, especially in taking into consideration the rest of the tracks, how they were written and developed. So I was a bit disappointed the way the album ended, but I will say, overall, it doesn't ruin the project. I just think the album could have ended, a bit differently. But nonetheless, I think that's kind of part of Mild High Club's charm. They don't really follow many rules. They kind of just do their own thing, which I think is probably, it's nice to see. Honestly, songwriting and, structuring albums can be very done the same way from album to album, regardless of the genre. So I will say Mild High Club kind of does, something a bit different. And I do enjoy a lot of these tracks. I will say almost about every other track, or maybe about, two or three tracks I could have done without. But other than that, I think this is a really nice listen. It makes me interested in this band. I want to hear more. I want to hear certain tracks become turned into full length projects, or just done again in a different way, or just presented again in another album. So yeah, I feel like this album is a success for this band, despite going so long between the second and third project. Hopefully the fourth one isn't 5 years from now, but nonetheless, or 4 years from now, however long it was. But nonetheless, yeah, I like this band. I like what they're doing, and hopefully they can just experiment and do a bit, and just continue to develop their sound. I really dig the psychiness to them as well. I think they have that down quite well, and it's done in a way that I think is somewhat original. So, yeah, definitely recommend this album to anyone that's just generally interested in this band. If you like psych music, or just dreamy ambient stuff. If you fit a certain profile of people that, listen to that music, I think you'll definitely get something from this album. If you're just generally interested in experimental music, you might dig this as well. I don't know how this, to a casual, music listener that listens to 2 or 3 artists a week, I don't know how this will necessarily, fit into their rotation. But hey, if you give it a chance, you might take away a bit from this album that, you might like some cuts, like for myself, and Dollar Hell. But yeah, good album. If I had to rate it, I'd say it's about a 7 out of 10. But that's just my opinion, nothing too serious. But I think the important thing to take away is that it's a nice project. I'm glad I listened to it. And hell, I'll probably see Mild High Club if they come by, my town at some point, because I'd like to see how they do things live too. Anyways, that's just my thoughts. In the comment section, let me know how you feel about this album if you listen to it. If not, leave a like, subscribe if you like what you heard. If not, leave a comment, good or bad. Subscribe on your listening service. Thanks for tuning in today. I'm music reviewer. My name is Josh, and I'll see y'all later.